Hello, my name is Eric Hines. I'm curator of film at Museum of the Moving Image in New York, and I welcome you to tonight's conversation between Shatara Michelle Ford and James Gray. I think we're all eager to have the two of them on here soon, so I won't take too long, but I do want to thank you all for finding us here. And if you've seen Test Pattern, welcome. This will be an amazing conversation. If you've not seen Test Pattern, it was released by Kino Lorber and is available on virtual cinema. You can watch that through Museum of the Moving Image, so go to our website and you can find it there. But it's also playing elsewhere in the country, and I think that for good reason, a lot of theaters are showing this film. And though we're not in physical buildings at the moment yet, at least not in New York, it's kind of an amazing thing to be able to see how many people are finding this film through virtual cinema. Test Pattern premiered at the 2019 BlackStar Film Festival and has been a real conversation piece ever since. It is the debut film by Shatara, and Shatara has a background where she has worked with James Gray before, which maybe they'll chat about a little bit. But James Gray, if you have just landed on Earth, I'll let you know that James Gray is one of the finest American filmmakers, and quite frankly, one of the finest filmmakers working today. James Gray is from Queens. He's an old friend of Museum of the Moving Image, and we're so happy to have him here. His films include Little Odessa, The Yards, which was set in some scenes feet away from Museum of the Moving Image. We Own the Night, Two Lovers, The Immigrant, Lost City of Z, and Ad Astra. And again, it's a pleasure to have them both here. I'm going to cede the stage to the two of them, and then I'll be back a little bit at the end. There is you can submit some questions to the YouTube chat. I think one of my colleagues is monitoring that. I think Shatara in particular can stay a little bit later for some questions. But first, let's get to James Gray and Shatara. Thank you so much for being here.
Hello, thank you, Eric, for such a totally unwarrantedly flattering introduction. I can introduce Shatara and say that I've known this one of my favorite people, one of the really, really brilliant young lady, and fantastic to see that she's working now in the medium, and the medium deserves her, and she deserves the medium of film. I guess I'm obliged to say that Shatara was my assistant on The Lost City of Zed, Eric. And I'm sure she has lots of incredibly bad stories about my behavior in the middle of the jungle, but that's for another time. We're going to talk about her fantastic movie today. Hi, Shatara.
Hey, James.
How's it going? How are you holding up through this crap? It's the worst, right?
Oh, yeah.
Well, anyway, I mean, we're lucky, I guess. We have it better than most, but even so, it doesn't matter. It's house arrest for everybody, I guess.
Indeed.
I guess the way we should start is, I saw your movie first, knew nothing about it, which of course is always the best way to watch a picture. I'm going to start out asking you a question, which I think sounds superficial, probably is because I'm pretty superficial, but I'm getting at something, and I'm going to ask, what does color mean to you?
I mean, it's everything, right? It's the unspoken. It's the thing that communicates all of those internal feelings and angst, and which is a feeling, but all of those things that are kind of like building up that have no clear like word for. That's what it means. You know, I found myself very kind of attached to the German expressionism movement. And I liked the way that color was used. And I liked how that was interpreted by Hitchcock in his practice. And it just makes sense to me. It's a language that I very quickly understood and received, and then like, I don't know, regurgitated for myself. So, you know, when I thought about color as a motif and test pattern, it certainly wasn't like this extra thing that I had to think about. It's truly how I probably communicate things out throughout my own lived experience anyway. So,
which Hitchcock in particular? I mean, did you have one that you particularly love?
I mean, I think that I love, I mean, that's different because I mean, my favorite Hitchcock movie is in black and white. My favorite is Strangers on a Train.
Really?
Yes, I love Strangers on a Train.
I mean, I love it too, but why that one?
I think there's a really interesting interplay with class, and also just like class, masculinity.
Right.
There's also like some weird like gender interplay that's very dark and sinister. I think that something that is consistent through all Hitchcock movies is that women tend to bear the brunt of all of the horrors of men's fantasies, desires, idiosyncrasies, insecurities, all of it. And Strangers on a Train, I think, was a really great representation of that. But it doesn't have color. But what I think the best expression of it is obviously Vertigo. I think Vertigo is so wonderful. I think it also like recalibrated my understanding of the use of color. But I would also say that, you know, the way in which like Todd Haynes in a much more like modern day way of like playing with color, and playing off of like, you know, the German expressionist movement and melodrama and the past kind of like culture of that also related and informed me with the language.
It's so weird you mentioned Todd Haynes because I did think of, and this is not to, by the way, not to not credit Todd Haynes for this because he deserves all the credit in the world, but I also was thinking a lot watching your film. I was thinking of the cinematographer Ed Lockman, who works with Todd Haynes, and his because your approach, it also feeds into point of view. The point of view of the film is extremely specific, and you will use planes of focus in a very unusual way. You know, there'll be stuff that, you know, our eye is trained to expect things in the frame to be in focus or out of focus as we watch, and your movie doesn't do that, doesn't adhere to all those rules. And I'm not talking about rack focus like in a Michael Bay movie, which is sort of an action concept of changing your point of view. There'll be a shot where you'll have something in the foreground in focus that is supposed to be out of focus. So the color is very much part of that point of view idea. So I guess I'm wondering also about your approach to point of view in the subject and how color I was hoping would lead to this idea of point of view.
Well, you know, yeah, again, I mean, it's hard, you know, to kind of like parse that stuff out because so much of it is just like this kind of like instinctual, guttural kind of experience. But the point of view that you're talking about is what I find to be the point of view of any marginalized person that's under an incredible amount of strain, stress, and trauma. And very much for this film, I was trying to express the idea of like what trauma really does feel like, you know, what fight or flight feels like, what the hyper awareness of certain things that really, to, you know, I don't know, the dominant culture, what we normalize as things to find important is not what is important to me. When I go into a bar in Austin and I'm sitting down, I'm highly aware of the fact that I'm probably the only Black person, and I'm looking, I don't know, my reference points, the things that kind of like I'm trained to pay attention to are very, very, very different than I think an actual, you know, just regular white person enjoying their very comfortable, normal space feels and sees. The thing that I first notice always are the exits. And then the next thing I look for are like people who could potentially be a threat to me. That's just normal. So again, that was something that I was trying to apply, not even intentionally to this, but I have to give credit to my cinematographer, Ludovica Isidori, because we spent a lot of time together and she knows me very well. And this is something that I didn't even need to explain to her, really. She would kind of, as we're planning the shots out, kind of bring up this idea or, you know, set up a shot and like look at it. And she already knew where I was going without me even really needing to explain it. So I'm lucky to have her in that respect.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think that the film, and this is really a tremendous, or I mean it, I should say, as a tremendous compliment. The film is not heavy-handed on issues of race at all. And in fact, when you watch it, the feeling you get is almost, at least I got, is almost of a kind of systemic rot, which maybe sounds a little harsh, but you get the sense that the system is at the edge of breakdown and that all of the focus of the system is to screw over any sense of kind of like the right thing to do, what your focus should be, how to behave. It's in some ways a very frightening movie for this reason. And I think it has to do with this idea of the systemic dysfunction. And you're not larding on kind of like some heavy-handed platitudes about injustice and so forth, which are already there anyway. Mm-hmm. So, which in that way, it makes your film quite unique, really, in the landscape, because that idea of systemic rot. I mean, I don't know. Did you preview this movie? I'm dying to know what an audience would have thought of this. I mean, I find previews kind of nauseating, but I'm wondering what your reaction was from an audience if you did show it.
Yeah, I mean, those are like three different things in there. Like, well, first say, and I'll go back to it.
Get out enough these days, so that's what.
Well, first say is that, like, yeah, I did. We screened it a lot. We had like 27, 28 some odd, maybe even more than that, test screenings, and they weren't to kind of get the, overall audience score, and that wasn't what it was for. I was deliberately looking for how my audience responded to certain just the movie itself. When did they laugh? When did they jeer? When were they whispering to each other? Because I was trying to see if what I was doing, I was getting away with it, and if I was getting the reaction that I actually wanted. But I'll go back to that for a second. I want to go just talk about the systemic rot thing, because I think it's really important, right? We are a society that is structured around capitalism, and capitalism is upheld by white supremacy and patriarchy, right? And then this country was founded by a whole bunch of white dudes who didn't want to pay taxes back to, England, effectively. And then they created a country that was already occupied, but that's another thing. They created a country in their image. And we think about these really wonderful founding documents, all men are created equal, so on and so forth. By the way, they use the word men, and they meant it, right? They weren't actually thinking about the other people. And then we think about the compromises they made, namely even the 3/5 compromise that identified someone like me as not a full human being. And so how do I expect that system to include me? And how do I expect the legacy of that system to create policies that are there to protect those who aren't in that foundational kind of understanding? Therefore, where this systemic rot comes from, there are all these cracks, right? There's all these cracks in the foundation of our society. And the rot, it's just all of these bodies that don't identify in those ways, that aren't thought about in those ways, falling through those cracks constantly. And, I experience it, and I also see it, and I feel sick all of the time. And so literally, like, my creation of this film, the way that I put this forward was me almost like, urgently like screaming to people, like, we can't keep doing this. Like, it's so obvious, and we're stressed in every single aspect of life, right? It's not just Renesha's experience as she navigates, trying to just live her life, getting assaulted, needing to get a rape kit, trying to get some sort of conclusion at the end of it. It's also in the, person that works at the urgent care that probably, has their own bills to pay, probably is doing shift work, is probably already like strapped and stressed at every, aspect of their life. And when Renesha and Evan come and ask for, help effectively, they're not fully participating in that experience because they've got their own stuff to deal with effectively. So that's the kind of thing that I was trying to express, is that everyone is stressed under this system, that we're all suffering under this system. And that's why it's really hard to do the right thing, whatever. And then even the concept of the right thing is subjective.
Of course.
So there's that. But back to your point, or back to your question about, the test screenings, I had lots of them. And my producer, Pinchin, and I were very deliberate. We really tried to kind of mix ages and, all sorts of demographics, race, gender, deliberately, and put them in a room to just kind of see how, one, they reacted when they watched the things, but also when it was over and they talked about the movie, how they reacted amongst each other. And I mean, in every single one of these test screenings, we had some sort of debate ensue between strangers because they had a different kind of like ideological perspective or position on what happened to Renesha, what the right thing should have been for Renesha, and if these were good guys or bad guys, which I think is interesting.
Mm.
That's
It
a lot.
certainly is. I mean, you mentioned a bunch of things in there which are of tremendous interest to me. I mean, you know, the first, it's interesting when I had a question, and I suppose usually I don't like to kind of boil things down to motive for characters because it's in some ways it's very difficult always to divine that. But in some ways, Evan seems more driven for the rape kit than she is. More
Yeah.
driven for some idea of justice than she is.
Yeah.
Which is very interesting, and it seemed right to me, but I'm not sure I could fully articulate why. I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah.
By
Yeah.
the way, I'm assuming everybody on the Zoom has seen the movie because I'm like ruining everything, but go ahead.
It's okay. Well, I mean, let's think about it. The system was designed for people like Evan, and therefore Evan's used to things working for him.
Right.
Period. Right.
Right.
So there's that. In the same way that, you know, perhaps Renesha knows that this is something that will be more complicated and exhaustive than she's willing to put time into right now, perhaps. But then let's think about the fact that like human beings make decisions for more than one reason. So let's think about the other reasons why Renesha may not be interested in this. Let's think about the culture, the toxic masculinity culture that we all participate in. Let's think about the culture of victim blaming that we all participate in. I mean, I feel like I don't really need to go into that, but I'm still experiencing like the deep collective trauma of having to witness like Christine Blasey Ford have to justify her, you know, experience to a whole bunch of people who are yelling at her. So like, I think you get what I mean. Like that is a very real thing that victims, survivors feel, you know? So, you know, Renesha is still working through, was this my fault? Did I deserve it? And maybe I don't therefore need to do any of this because it maybe was all down to me. So she's working through that. I think she's also just working through the fact that she's deeply uncomfortable and tired. And even if the quote unquote right thing to do is to go get a rape kit, I mean, that's up to her. And if she's not ready to do that, then this is not really what we should be doing. Then we've got, you know, the other things that Evan's thinking about, right? Perhaps he's thinking about the fact that maybe he's, you know, falling into the victim blaming element as well, kind of thinking, well, you know, Renesha did go out. She's a beautiful woman. Perhaps something happened and she doesn't actually want to tell me. And maybe the rape kit proves something like that. And I'm not saying that's a massive drive for his decision making, but there's elements of that. And I kind of already kind of created this cocktail for something like that. If you notice early in the film, every single scene that Renesha and Evan are in, Renesha's leaving. She's the one who always walks out of the room. She's always the one that's kind of leaving him there. And there's this dynamic that I was trying to create of like this perhaps insecurity that Evan is holding, thinking that maybe Renesha's too good for him. And one day she's going to wake up and decide that she doesn't want to be with him anymore. That's very much a part of it. And that's something that, you know, Will and Brittany and I talked about, like what that kind of thing feels like. Also, when it comes to, you know, Brittany and I developing Renesha's character, we're thinking about the fact that Renesha is very happy and she's very, very ready to kind of move on to the next step, but she's waiting for Evan to do his part and to, you know, profess that. And he isn't really the personality type that's that straightforward. And we've seen plenty of evidence for that in the movie about how he's not necessarily that good at asserting himself. And so she's misreading his lack of assertion as, you know, maybe disinterest. So there's a bit of a disconnect between them already once that night happens that I think, again, brings all of this stuff to the forefront.
Well, Another thing also though is that I did not, and maybe this is my misread or something. I,
Mm,
I, I, I guess there's no such thing really as a misread, right? It's what I saw in it. But when I first was watching it, I didn't know what the story was on purpose. Um, I kind of thought he would turn out to be malevolent.
yeah.
It has to do with stereotyped ideas I have in my own head. You know, he has tattoos. He's a certain social class. He's I I for some reason mistrusted his niceness to her, and I thought, oh shit. Uh, but actually, he's not ill-intentioned at all towards her. You get the sense that his feelings towards her are quite genuine,
Mhm.
but he's also very emotionally repressed in some ways and can't actually express his love for her for a variety of reasons, all of which I projected a bunch of reasons on as well. And that's very sophisticated. It also affected how I perceived the time frame of the film unfolding, which is also, I think, unique. It's sort of like it feels like it's a 2 days, but then the time's longer and then time's shorter. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit about your presentation of the time frame of it, because it seems unique in that way and rather brilliantly conceived in that way. The time
Yeah.
frame.
Yeah, well, I think the guiding principle for me in this movie was emotional authenticity, right? Of course, we're dealing with real life, and real life and very real lived experiences, not necessarily, exactly to a T for any person that we know, but just the idea of like, we know this stuff happens. These scenarios are very like typical and common. And more than anything, like I was very, very interested and in general with my work, I'm very interested in the ways in which we as humans get into our own way when it comes to connecting with another person. And so, as that relates to time, there's a couple of things. There's trauma and how trauma subverts and, warps time. There's just a kind of like memory and processing of experiences as you kind of go through things the first time.
I'm
It
so
means
sorry. I'm so
what's that?
sorry to interrupt you, but what you just said is very important, and I don't want to lose it because the film does it really, really fantastically well. Which is how, and I've meant to bring this up to you, and I've forgotten it on many occasions, so I wanted to stop you. Which is how the traumatic event, it totally screws up your perception of time. Now, obviously, that's never happened to me. What happens to her? But I've had other obviously terribly traumatic things happen to me, and I perceive time the same way that it's
Absolutely.
depicted in your film, and that's really a triumph. So I wanted to stop and just say that. Sorry, go ahead.
No, thank you. That's. I mean, again, that was one of the really big driving principles for how we structured the movie. Because, in some ways, it's really even hard to say if the movie is an entire kind of memory, or if it's this kind of like flashback, but like forward trajectory, and that's has everything to do with how I was centering Renesha's experience as she's processing compound trauma. And because there's so, again, as a Black person, as a woman, like there's so much constantly happening in general that kind of it builds itself on top of each other. So there's
You're
so
right.
many little microaggressions in general that Renisha's having on the daily basis that she's really not fully processing, especially in that kind of environment that she's in, a very predominantly white, seemingly liberal, environment where people think that they're, woke and progressive, and yet you can still sit in a backyard and have the person who loves you talk about branding you with no full kind of concept of the history of slavery and how that could even relate to the person that he's saying it to. He truly means it in a loving and endearing way. That's traumatic. Like, in the moment, like, I'm sure, like, there's a dissonance. And so you bury that stuff. I've been in plenty of experiences like that just around white people. They say the craziest shit to me. And I'm just like, I know this isn't meant in a harmful way. So I'm going to kind of have this dissonant kind of experience. I'm going to separate that. I'm going to compartmentalize that, but it always comes seeping back. And so that's kind of what I was going for here. So, you know, I'd written the film slightly out of order, but the order that it is in the script is not the order that ended up on screen. And one of my editors, Katie Miller, did the kind of assembly cut for me, and she tried to do it as much in order, as true to the script as she possibly could. And we watched it and I was horrified. And I'm like, of course, that's typical, like whatever, but I couldn't really articulate what I was upset about, but I made her watch Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind with me, because there's something about the way that that film was structured that like unlocked it for me. And what I realized, it's because it's so much about internal processing and memory and like kind of being in conversation with yourself about how certain events happened. And that's what helped me rearrange the film and associate it with like emotional processing. So I can't even fully say that the structure of the film is in any way linear, but it's not also driven by flashback. It's almost this like kind of, you know, in like, it kind of like swirls and envelopes on itself and expands.
Well, very dreamlike, very dreamlike,
Yeah.
almost nightmarish, you know, and to use a fancy movie word, oniric, right, which is a little pretentious, but that's the word they use. But it's very kind of like I guess the word would be nightmarish. There's some nightmarish quality to the movie, but it serves to give her dignity and agency. It's interesting. Being in her mind validates her experience to us, which is, I guess, everything, really.
Yes. Yes. You know, and I sit with that slogan, you know, believe women. And it's like, well, you know, believe survivors, believe people. And that's kind of one of those principles I kind of had in my head as I was trying to kind of keep us in Renesha's head. It's that, again, trauma takes forever for you to swim through. And it's on its own timeline, each individual timeline. And the fact that we expect people to speak to something or, you know, or defend themselves, advocate for themselves in the heat of, as all of that stuff is still processing, it's deeply unfair and incredibly flawed with, you know, the way in which we deal with this stuff. And so my hope is that us sitting with her in that, we kind of have a better understanding, an emotional kind of relationship to how trauma works. And we back off. As a culture, we back off as we expect these things from people. We accept and we recognize that it's going to take a ton of time. And we need to be building mechanisms in place to kind of support that and navigate that with people.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, I'm getting all kinds of texts here. Eric is back. Hi, Eric.
I'm back. Hello. Thanks. This is amazing. It's hard to intervene, but I think James, you're going to be hopping off in a minute. And I have a few questions from the audience. Is that still cool? Or did you have another one, James?
Yeah, it's about, I have to attend a school thing for my son, but you know, he's only my son, so. No, I'll stay on. I'll be in communication with my wife, and we'll see how much time I can cheat before I come in. So
okay, so why don't I ask one from the audience, and then you come back in, James, when you get that answer. There's a couple different couple questions coming through, Shatara. One, I'm wondering if the audience member is wondering if there was a scene that was the germ for the narrative. Was there one scene that you started with that it grew from, or was it sort of macro to micro?
Ooh, yeah, it was macro to micro. And I think that's how I work in general. So I have a background in sociology and political science. And so I'm always thinking about human beings as they are kind of being shuffled and navigated within, you know, all of these systems that are you know, kind of dictating our lives effectively. And so what I like to do is look at things, you know, so I was looking at some major things. I was looking at patriarchy, and I was looking at race as white supremacy, blackness, whiteness, and some of like policing. And all I saw constantly within this, especially as it relates to how we treat rape kits and how we treat sexual assault, especially under the umbrella of the Me Too movement and just the the larger discussion we've been having about consent is that there was a lot of nuance being missed, and until we can, as a society, as a culture, engage with that nuance, not a lot's going to shift. And so I then started kind of drawing human beings inside of that stuff. And then I kept layering extra, crap effectively, make it the most vulnerable person that I could think about. And in this case for me, especially related to all the stuff that I was thinking about and experienced at the time personally, I was like, well, make that person a Black woman in a state that has a terrible track record with policing, especially when it relates to people of color, and also has a terrible track record with women's bodily autonomy and sexual health and rights effectively. So that brought up a few states, but Texas is the easiest to shoot in. So
you had your states to choose from. I've got to go, guys. Shatara, we love you. We'll talk soon.
Thanks, James.
Bye, guys. Thanks so much.
Thank you. But they're rolling in, so I'm going to keep going. And from that, adding to that last answer, the question about the situation in Texas and whether or not that is actually, someone from New York wondering if it's similarly harrowing for folks sort of looking to find whatever, to have access to rape kits, to be dealt with by professionals in a different way. Mm-hmm. Is that specific to Texas, or is this sort of a national issue? Yeah,
it's a national issue. I mean, look, I did a ton of research. There was anecdotes I was getting from, Oregon, Washington, Missouri, Ohio, all over the place, including New York City. So it's there. And I think that we have to think about it on a larger level and maybe put it even in a more, contemporary context. Look how difficult it's been for states to get on the same page when it comes to, the vaccine rollout, shutdowns or no shutdowns. This is where the federal system really falls down in a lot of ways. But on top of that, it's the terrible trouble of public policy and state legislatures, especially as we're involving politics. And again, time after time after time, the most vulnerable are the ones who are the least thought about or heavily legislated against. So I grew up in Missouri, and constantly my body, for many different reasons, was legislated against. I mean, it still is. It's terrible. I live in Pennsylvania right now. Terrible. Pennsylvania state legislature is some sort of nefarious other thing, when it comes to the most vulnerable citizens. And so, I think we have to remember that the backlog and the access to them in particular, that is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to just failures of policy when it relates to marginalized people.
And another question about if you had a consultant who had dealt with rape victims before, is that something that?
Yeah. So Amani Starnes, who plays Nurse Peg, she was doing a PhD at Stanford at the time, and she worked with a SANE nurse up there. We also did a few bits and pieces of consulting and checking in with forensic nurses, nationally, who kind of just double checked with us. They even sent us a rape kit and talked us through it. So, I mean, we did some pretty extensive research to make sure that we got it right. We wanted to know what was the exact right way to do it. And then from there, we can take, all of the anecdotes, all of the reporting about the inconsistencies. But if we didn't have that kind of standard of what was correct, I think the whole thing would have fallen down.
There's another one about, and I think you covered this a little bit in your conversation with James, but the decision to have a mixed race couple. Mm-hmm. And if you could talk just a little bit more about that, perhaps, in terms of the relevance of that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, again, if I'm trying to have a conversation about race in America, it doesn't, I think it doesn't work unless you have the kind of white experience in parallel. And I think that's because there's so many assumptions about how things are supposed to work or how things do work. And obviously in the last 4 years, I think we've had more conversations about how there are multiple Americas and multiple experiences, but we still don't kind of take the time to kind of, I don't know, put those things side by side and in conflict. And like, what better way to explore how policy fails the most vulnerable by kind of putting the person who always gets looked after and thought about alongside you. So there was that. I'm also really interested in examining power. And I think that interracial relationships, especially Black-white relationships, are in America a very good like examination of a power imbalance that's just like baked in, because we live in a white supremacist society. So again, that was something that just is easy to kind of look side by side. I also am in an interracial relationship. I'm married to a white British man, and I've been with him for like 16 years. And so we've seen our own fair share of stuff. And like, you know, he's pretty solid. And because he's not from here, he doesn't have skin in the game. And so he's not very like, he's not quick to argue with me when I'm saying, no, this isn't going to work. But there are those few times though, where we'll move through a space and it's terrible for me and he just doesn't expect it. And I think, again, those are the constant little kind of like fractures in relationships. And especially when they're in this kind of like interracial ilk that I think is worth exploring and worth discussing. So
I love the way that he doesn't respond to these moments as if he now gets it.
yeah.
It's more like, wait, this is happening to me. This is not supposed to happen. And he's not expressing that, and he's not that sort of character. He's not being villainized, but there's that real, as you're saying, there's that real sort of shade of difference, which is crucial, which is that once that's happening, it's not all of a sudden realizing what she's going through. It's what he's going through.
Exactly. But again, I think that's very indicative. I mean, if we think about the conversations that have been had over the summer after the tragic but very consistent and not surprising wave of, you know, murder of Black people by the hands of police, it seems like, you know, white folks are starting to wake up and ask questions. And one of the things that we kind of keep saying as y'all are all trying to do the right thing is stop centering yourselves and it's not about you. So again, this is a very natural thing. I understand it. The whole world's been set for you. You're so focused on finding a way to make it about you. And that means that the work that you're doing is about alleviating your pain and your guilt. And it's not actually centering and accommodating the folks that are needing the support. And so again, that was one of the important things I was kind of having like a low key conversation about is like, what is white allyship and camaraderie? What does that look like and how does it fail? And again, Evan fails constantly. But.
And there's the reaction of it shouldn't be this way, mm-hmm. which is true, mm-hmm. but it doesn't incorporate, or it can often not incorporate an understanding of what it's like to have lived all this time.
That's right.
When it's this way.
That's right. And there's a tendency to be in shock about that for way too long. You know, it's like while everyone's crying about how it shouldn't be this way, people are still dying. Exactly. You know, people are still not getting the things that they need. And so I think that's, you know, an urgent call for some reevaluation of behavior.
Yeah. I mean, it's extraordinary that the script and the film works that way, that it really is in the moment and makes so much sense in terms of these two people, and yet, of course, echoes out in all the ways that we're talking about it here. Switching gears just a little bit, but a fair question about other films that you watched. Anything you talk about Hitchcock and other things, but things you watched and maybe showed the cast to establish tone and other things you're
yeah. A really, really, really important one is Hitchcock's Marnie. Mm-hmm. You know, the assault scene itself, I almost kind of like matched frame for frame in some ways with that kind of terrible, harrowing scene of, you know, Sean Connery kind of going in on Tippi Hedren and on the boat. And mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and I'm weirdly in conversation with that movie because I think there's something really interesting about Hitchcock talks a lot about, without really being explicit, about possession and almost about how possession is like saving this helpless woman who's experiencing all of this trauma.
Mhm.
And again, I think there's some elements of Evan that thinks that, like, by like having some sort of rights over her is protecting her and doing the right thing as a man, but also he's deeply insecure and doesn't want to lose this thing. And so there's almost like this kind of psychological play of ownership that's not letting her be, a full autonomous person. So I watched that a lot, and I talked about it a lot with Ludovica and Eloise, Eloise Ayala, my production designer, and Brianna Rowe, my costume designer. I'm trying to think of other things that we talked about a lot. Dog Day Afternoon. I'm heavily influenced by like movies in the late 60s and early 70s, because I think that we're living in a very similar moment where there's a lot of social upheaval, a lot of things are just kind of like blowing our minds left and right. And it's hard for us to kind of hold on to it. But on top of it, there's like an urgent call for some kind of, I don't know, action and reconciliation and reflection. And Dog Day Afternoon is definitely a movie like that makes me think of, those feelings. And I feel like there's a scene that I kept making Ludovica watch over and over and over again, to kind of construct the pea cup dropping in the hospital. I can't fully remember, but it was just like very like clever use of like camera work, but yeah, I can't fully recall it now, even though I watched it billions of times. I did shoot this movie like 3 years ago. But yeah, that was one. I'm trying to think, there's so many more. Another Year, which sounds kind of out of left field if you think about it. But I was so interested in kind of, and I get weird feedback about how the dialogue works in the movie. And like, if it, human beings are awkward. I don't know where we get this idea that, when we talk to each other, it's like super smooth and like, it just kind of moves really well, and it just doesn't. And something I really appreciate about Mike Leigh in particular is that his approach to kind of constructing dialogue and also constructing characters super kind of communal and collaborative. And that was an energy that I really tried to bring to the movie. And so again, as I was trying to get, my heads of department to think about how we're going to let this movie breathe and move, Another Year was a really good example of just kind of what I was going for on like a very kind of like base settling level.
I love that. I mean, I love all three of those films, and I love hearing you talk about that, because obviously they're not three films I would have necessarily said straight off in seeing the film, but I can absolutely see how maybe they all got their way in there in some way. Marnie, I rewatched recently, and I that film is going to confound me forever, and it's such, but I mean, it's disturbing. My sense of identification is shifting all over the place, and can really see why that may have been helpful in some ways for Tess Patter.
Yeah, I mean, and it's just absolutely frightening, and I'm not really sure that was what Hitchcock was
That's the
intending,
thing, right? Right.
but it's straight up like the scariest movie I've seen in a while,
You don't know where the authorship quite resides in terms of
Mm-mm,
those characters, which is,
mm-mm,
I'm grateful for it, because I'll watch it forever.
yeah.
An outgrowth of that, I think, and it's probably the last question for this evening, and thank you for staying on late to answer these, about music and your music choices, in particular the Nutcracker Suite, which is a very, it's quite a choice. So if you don't mind talking about that.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is one of the benefits, right, of making a movie that you pay for with your own debt and savings. I was already taking a risk, so it's like, who am I doing it for if it's not for me? So I might as well just really, really go there. I thought about that very early on. I actually even think I wrote it in the first draft of the script. And the idea that I was going for is trying to express how at this point in time, Evan and Renesha are doing a very like refined dance, a waltz, if you will. It's perfectly timed. They all know where they're supposed to be. There's no real thought to it anymore. It's just repetitive and simple. And I thought that, first of all, I think that's absurd. Like, they've been driving around all day doing this shit. And so now it's just like perfectly timed. And like, that's crazy. And it also it makes me think about all the times in which we engage with bureaucracy. And there is this level of kind of like repetition and precise movement, which is also really absurd and silly. And so I found it silly. But also I wanted to kind of underline it and make it very clear that it's silly and unnecessary. So I wanted to put a song that I knew everyone knows as a kind of almost like a signal of like, this is some like performative behavior that we all kind of participate in, and it's kind of not okay. And I thought a lot about Kubrick. I thought a lot about 2001 and the purpose of why, that same kind of music shows up in certain elements as they're moving from, space station to space station. So,
That's fantastic. Yeah, it's great. And absolutely does do that. You're right. I mean, there are only so many songs that we all know and can sort of have that displaced experience, as you're saying, and the 2000, of course it's impossible not to think of 2001. And yeah, it's brilliant, really, really brilliant. Thank you, Shatara. Do you mind, I'm now that I feel like I've got stolen time with you and I'm tempted to keep going, but I think we probably should let you go. But do you mind letting us know a little bit? Obviously it's been a trying year for everybody, but can you let us know what might be next and what you might be working towards, if you're willing to share?
Oh, I mean, I wish I knew. I really do. I really wish I knew. I think, honestly, Eric, I didn't think I was going to have a career. And like I said, I spent a lot of my own debt on a movie. Therefore, I'd been spending time trying to, make money and not be in debt anymore. And I didn't have time to even think about what else I can do with my life as it relates to my art. Certain events have conspired that means that I can do that again. And I have some ideas, but I need somebody to give me money first. So
that's always the
how
thing.
that goes.
Well, I have a feeling that more and more people are going to want to give you money for whatever you do next after this.
Let's hope so.
I'd love to meet you in person. I'd love to have you at the museum as soon as
I can't wait. It's one of my favorites. Like, this truly means a lot. Like, it's kind of a dream come true, and I'm still not fully, with it enough to appreciate what's happening right now. But it's been such a gift. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a whirlwind for everybody. We are going to be back in the building soon enough, and we'll have you as soon as we possibly can. Please.
Sounds great.
Thank you, Shatara.
Thanks,
Everybody, for
Eric.
joining us out in the audience.
Thank you.